In the year 1913, the world stood on the edge of a golden age. The great empires ruled with confidence. The cities pulsed with life. Trains connected continents. Oceans carried ships to every corner of the globe. This was an era of elegance, of steam and steel, of kings and queens, of grand palaces and bustling marketplaces. It was a time when people believed they had mastered nature, politics, and even time itself. Europe, at the heart of it all, saw itself as the center of civilization. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. France held its colonies tightly. Germany rose as an industrial titan. Russia loomed vast and mysterious in the east, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of cultures and languages, struggled to hold itself together. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Alliances were drawn not in friendship but in suspicion. Armies grew larger. Navies raced to build bigger ships. Newspapers fueled patriotism, while secret treaties bound nations together like invisible chains. Yet few imagined what was coming. Few could believe that peace could collapse so suddenly, that the world they knew could be shattered beyond recognition. Because in just a few months, the storm would come, and nothing would ever be the same again. This is the story of how everything began with World War I. It was a hot summer morning in Sarajevo. The year was 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had arrived on a state visit to Bosnia, a land recently annexed by Austria-Hungary and filled with unrest. He was not just a royal figurehead. He was a man of contradictions, a reformer who wanted to reshape the empire, a soldier who had seen war from afar, and now unknowingly a man walking into history's most deadly trap. Crowds lined the streets, flags waved, but beneath the surface something else stirred. Hidden among the spectators were young men fueled by nationalism, anger, and dreams of revolution. They were members of a secret group known as the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist organization that believed Austria-Hungary had no right to rule over Slavic lands. Among them was one man who would change the world forever, Gavrilo Princip. The motorcade made its way through the city. Then suddenly a bomb exploded. It bounced off the Archduke's car and landed behind him, injuring an officer. Panic spread. The Archduke, shaken but unharmed, continued to his destination. Most people thought the day was over, but it wasn't. Later that afternoon, after completing his official duties, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit the injured officer at the hospital, but there was a mistake in the route. His driver turned down a street where fate was waiting. Right there, standing in front of a small cafe, was Gavrilo Princip. In a moment that lasted only seconds, he stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck the Archduke in the neck, the other hit his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead. The assassin stood frozen, stunned by what he had done. Witnesses stared in horror. Word of the assassination spread like wildfire. What happened next is often forgotten, but it was just as important as the act itself. Austria-Hungary, enraged, demanded justice. Serbia refused to comply fully with their ultimatum. And so, on the 28th of July, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war. But this was no longer just a local conflict. Because alliances had been signed in secret, treaties bound nations together like invisible chains. Russia, protector of Slavs, mobilized for Serbia. Germany, bound to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, prepared for battle. Britain, torn between neutrality and duty, finally entered the fray when Germany invaded Belgium. In less than a month, the entire continent was at war. And the world was about to witness something he had never seen before. Total war. This was not just a political crisis. It was the end of peace as the world knew it. And it all began with 2 gunshots in Sarajevo. In the summer of 1914, most people believed the war would be over by Christmas. Soldiers marched off to battle with flowers in their caps, convinced they were fighting a noble and short campaign. Generals planned sweeping cavalry charges and bold advances across open fields, just like the wars of the past. But what followed was nothing like anyone expected. The moment the armies clashed on the Western Front, the illusion shattered. Machine guns mowed down entire battalions in minutes. Artillery turned fields into craters of mud, and trenches became the new battlefield, stretching from Belgium all the way to Switzerland. This was not the war anyone had prepared for. For 4 long years, millions of soldiers lived and died in these muddy, freezing, disease-ridden ditches. They faced constant bombardment, rats that fed on the dead, and the unbearable stench of rotting flesh. Some went mad, others simply disappeared beneath the earth after a direct hit. Yet still, the lines barely moved. The war became one of attrition, not movement, a deadly game of inches. Battles like the Somme and Verdun cost hundreds of thousands of lives for only a few miles of land. And as the war dragged on, the world realized something terrifying. This was no longer just a war between armies. It was a war against civilians, economies, and even time itself. Entire nations were mobilized for warlike machines. Factories stopped making consumer goods and focused solely on weapons. Governments took control of railroads, mines, and farms. Women stepped into jobs, once held only by men. And then came the new weapons tools of destruction unlike anything seen before. Poison gas invisible, silent, and deadly drifted across snow, man's land, burning lungs and blinding soldiers. Tanks, slow, clunky, but unstoppable in time, rolled onto the battlefield for the first time. Airplanes once used only for observation now dropped bombs and dueled in dogfights high above the trenches. Even the seas were no longer safe. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and even passenger liners like the RMS Lusitania. One torpedo could end hundreds of innocent lives and change the course of the war forever. This was total war. Not fought on battlefields alone, but in factories, kitchens, newspapers, and hearts. Every citizen was touched by it. Every nation felt its weight. By 1916, the world had changed beyond recognition, and yet there was still no end in sight. By 1918, the war had not only consumed millions of lives, it had begun to consume entire empires. The great powers that had ruled for centuries were now crumbling under the weight of war, debt, and revolution. One by one, the old orders collapsed, and from their ashes rose the nations we know today. Let's begin in the East with the fall of the Russian Empire. In 1917, as the war dragged on with no end in sight, the Russian people had had enough. Food was scarce, soldiers mutinied, and in February of that year, Tsar Nicholas II, ruler of Russia for over 2 decades, was forced to abdicate. A provisional government took control, trying desperately to keep Russia in the war, but they failed. Just months later, in October 1917, a second revolution erupted. Led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this time it wasn't just about reform, it was about complete transformation. The Russian Empire was dead. In its place rose the Soviet Union, a communist superpower that would shape global politics for the next century. Across Central Europe, another giant was falling, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It had been a patchwork of nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, and many more held together by a fragile peace. But the war shattered that unity. Nationalist movements grew stronger. Demands for independence turned into open rebellion. When the war ended, Austria-Hungary was officially dissolved, and from its remains came new countries: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, and parts of modern-day Poland, Ukraine, Romania, and Italy. This redrawing of borders changed the face of Europe forever. Meanwhile, in the southeast, the Ottoman Empire, once known as the sick man of Europe, finally breathed its last. For centuries, it had ruled vast lands stretching from the Middle East to North Africa and into the Balkans. But after siding with Germany in the war, defeat was inevitable. The empire was dismantled. Its territories were divided among Britain and France under the guise of mandates. Out of this collapse came the foundations of the modern Middle East, with new borders drawn not by history or culture, but by European diplomats in boardrooms far away. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine were born, many still struggling with the consequences of those decisions today. Even the German Empire, one of the Central Powers, did not survive the war intact. Defeated and humiliated, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to exile in the Netherlands. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place rose the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at democracy. But the wounds of war ran deep, and the pain of surrender would echo through the years, giving rise to a darkness that would soon consume the world again. So, what does all this mean? It means that World War I was not just a war of weapons and trenches, it was a war of identity, power, and transformation. It was the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. From the ashes of empires rose nations. From the chaos of war came revolutions. And from the ruins of peace came something even more dangerous. Resentment. Resentment that would fuel the next great storm waiting just around the corner. When the guns finally fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The Great War was over. But peace is not simply the absence of war, and what followed would prove just how fragile that peace truly was. In the aftermath of WW1, the victorious Allies gathered in Paris to shape the future. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, and it would become one of the most controversial peace agreements in history. Germany, stripped of land, military, and pride, was forced to accept full responsibility for starting the war. They were ordered to pay massive reparations, billions of gold marks, crippling their economy and fueling deep resentment. Hyperinflation soon followed. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost millions of marks. People burned money to stay warm. And while Europe tried to rebuild, the wounds of war never truly healed. Across the continent, political extremism began to rise. Fascist movements gained strength. Nationalism turned into hatred. And in Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler found his voice and his mission. He blamed the loss of the war not on the battlefield, but on politicians, communists, and Jews, calling them the November criminals who had betrayed Germany from within. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Bolsheviks had built a new state on the ruins of the old empire, and the West watched with growing fear. The League of Nations was created to prevent another global war, but it lacked real power. Major nations like the United States never fully joined. Others ignored its rulings when it suited them. Borders drawn in Paris sowed the seeds of future conflict, especially in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The Ottoman Empire was carved up by Britain and France, creating mandates rather than true independence. Iraq, Syria, Palestine, these names became states, but often without the unity or identity to hold them together. In Eastern Europe, nationalism flourished, and so did ethnic tensions. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were stitched together from former empires, but they were far from stable. And as the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the world once again began to darken. Germany rearmed in secret. Japan invaded Manchuria. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Democracy collapsed in country after country. And then came the moment that sealed the fate of the next Great War. On the 1st of September 1939, less than 21 years after the end of WW1, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. So, was this war inevitable? Or was it the direct consequence of the flawed peace that followed WW1? The truth lies somewhere in between. Because the First World War didn't just destroy empires and redraw maps, it shattered trust, bred hatred, and left behind a broken world order. It planted the seeds of the future, and the world was too blind or too tired to stop them from growing. What happened next was not a surprise. It was the echo of a war that never truly ended. We often think of history as a series of distant events, battles fought long ago, by people very different from us. But what if the world we know today was born not in the Cold War, not in the digital age, but in the trenches of World War I? Because when we look around us at our borders, our politics, our conflicts, we are still living in the echoes of that war. The rise of nationalism, born in the aftermath of WW1. The global dominance of the United States, cemented during and after the war. The birth of propaganda, surveillance, and mass media, all refined during those years. Even modern terrorism and ethnic conflict have roots in the chaos that followed the fall of empires. This was not just a war between nations. It was a war that changed the way the world worked. It gave us new technologies, tanks, planes, chemical weapons that redefined warfare forever. It gave us international institutions like the League of Nations, which would later inspire the United Nations. And it gave us powerful ideologies, fascism, communism, democracy, that would battle for supremacy in the century to come. But, perhaps most importantly, it taught us something deeply human, that peace cannot be forced through fear or punishment, that broken nations must be rebuilt with care, not punished with pride, and that every decision made in the name of victory leaves a legacy far beyond the battlefield. So why does this war still matter today? Because it reminds us that no war ends when the guns fall silent. Its consequences ripple through time, shaping leaders, borders, and beliefs long after the last soldier has laid down his rifle. World War I was not just the beginning of modern war. It was the beginning of the modern world. And its story, the story of ambition, tragedy, hope, and failure, is still being written in our lives today. Thank you for watching.